Welcome to Capitol Report, hosted by your Congressman, Adam Schiff. Each month, Capitol Report keeps you informed of progress being made in Washington, D.C. and at home on public policy issues of interest to our community. And now, here's the host of the show, your Congressman, Adam Schiff.
Hello, I'm Congressman Adam Schiff, and welcome to Capitol Report. It's my great pleasure to have as my guest today Arturo Sarukhan. He is the Mexican Ambassador to the United States and a good friend. And Ambassador, I want to welcome you and thank you for taking the time to join me.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
You have a fascinating biography, and it starts with your ancestors who come from some challenging places and times. Will you tell us a little bit about your grandparents on both sides?
Yeah, sure. I was born in Mexico, but I'm the grandson and son of conflict refugees on both sides. My paternal grandparents fled the genocide against the Armenians at the end of the Ottoman Empire. And my grandfather was a Russian Armenian who was Kerensky's aide-de-camp. And when Kerensky loses the civil war to Lenin, he has to flee. He goes to Italy. My grandmother had fled Istanbul, and she arrives in Venice. They get married in Venice. And when Mussolini comes to power in the early 30s in Italy, my grandfather says, seen that story before, let's get the hell out of here, and they go to Mexico. And on my mother's side, they are Catalonian Jews who, when they lose the civil war against Franco in 1939 in Spain, cross the Pyrenees into France, and then come in the second boatload of Spanish Republican refugees fleeing fascism in Spain and come to Mexico. So my parents meet at university. They're both biologists, and I was born in Mexico.
That's an incredible story, and your mere existence is quite miraculous.
It is.
Given all that your grandparents had to endure.
It's not only miraculous, but I think it speaks to one of the great strengths of our two societies, which is that we are two nations, even though sort of common wisdom usually does not place or lump Mexico in the same category as the United States, but we're both two countries that have had a very generous asylum refugee policy in the case of Mexico, and in the case of the United States, a country built on successive flows of immigrant communities that have made this country what it is.
Absolutely. And how do you feel shaped by the experience that your family has had?
Well, I think that's the prime reason, especially coming from a family of scientists, both my parents and my sister are scientists, that I ended up as a career diplomat. I think that the fact of my personal history, convinced me early on of the need to give back to the country that generously allowed both my families to remake their lives in Mexico by being a public servant, by being engaged in public policy, and second, because I think that also shapes my understanding of the responsibilities that countries like yours and like mine have in a post-Cold War world in which we need to ensure that the responsibility to protect becomes one of the mainstays of this new rules-based international system of the 21st century, where issues like genocide and human rights and the deepening and the widening of democracy are sort of should be some of the guidelines of our foreign policies in the world.
Well, Ambassador, as we've joked before, with your Armenian, Mexican, and Jewish lineage, you're a perfect fit for our district, but you do a marvelous job representing Mexico and are a wonderful diplomat, and it's really a pleasure to sit down with you.
Thank you. I promise I won't run in your district until you have moved on to much greater things that I'm sure will be awaiting your future.
I thank you for that. I want to talk about one of the most pressing issues that our countries face right now. I know it's of great interest to my constituents, and it is very timely given just within the recent few days we had more news of some mass killings in Mexico. I think it was 49. Yeah. People who appeared to have been caught up in the fight between two of the most powerful cartels. unfortunately, we in this country are responsible for a lot of the weapons that are heading south. We also present a lot of the demand for the narcotics heading north. So we have this mutually destructive trade, and disproportionately the violent impact of that is falling in Mexico. How do you assess the situation? Do you feel like there's any light at the end of the tunnel, and what more can be done to try to bring about an end to this horrific violence?
Yeah, I think that it is important for people on both sides of the border to understand that there's a very simple equation, that in this fight we will win or we will lose together. Yeah. Our two countries are so connected, interconnected in fact, on a host of issues, that people sometimes tend to forget that yes, whereas drugs are moving in one direction, guns and bulk cash are moving in the other. And that it is only under the paradigm of joint responsibility that both countries need to undertake that we will be able to roll back and defang organized crime working on both sides of our common border. It's not going to be an easy fight. It's going to take time. It's going to take it's probably going to be a generational thing. I have frequently said that whoever thought that this was going to be won in a year, in 3 years, in 5 years is probably smoking too much of what we see in Mexico. Look at Colombia, look at what it has taken them to enhance the rule of law, strengthen the judiciary, bring down violent crimes. You're talking about a generational effort. But it's not only a generational effort within Mexico, it's a generational effort between our both countries. That is the sustained engagement, collaboration, cooperation between the U.S. And Mexico, where Congress has played a pivotal role in approving the Mérida Initiative, which beyond the direct channeling of equipment and institutional building capabilities that has gone down through the Mérida Initiative, it is really about providing a sense of collaboration, of a changing of the paradigms with which traditionally Mexico and the United States have fought organized crime. For many, many years, and you'll remember this, especially in the 90s, it was popular for many in the United States to wag their finger at Mexico and say, you're responsible for a great majority of the drugs coming into the United States. And Mexico, conveniently and nationalistically, in a chest-thumping type of way, would say, well, if we're the springboard, you're the swimming pool. I think both countries have greatly come to understand that we will only be able to tackle this together. I think that we've started to see some important traction achieved in Mexico. I think there is an important dislocating effect in the ability of the transnational criminal organizations operating in Mexico in degrading their command, control, intelligence capabilities. The challenge is translating that, which is happening at 35,000 feet, to what is happening at the ground level, and diminishing the levels of violence being unleashed by the drug syndicates, whether they're pushing back against the state or whether they're fighting amongst each other for the control of trafficking routes and staging grounds of drugs coming into the United States, which is in part the responsible factor behind some of these killings. This dramatic and heinous episode that we just saw this weekend in the state of Nuevo León, across the border from Texas, is exactly that. It is the result of two rival gangs slugging it out for control of the trafficking routes of drugs into the United States.
Ambassador, I recall the 90s well, and at the time I was an assistant U.S. attorney in Los Angeles and prosecuting a lot of drug cases. Yep. Interestingly, I remember Colombia and the problem it was going through in the late 80s and early 90s. And many of the features that I saw and the kind of evolution of the struggle against the narcotics trade and organized crime there, I see playing out in Mexico also. At the time when the government first embarked on an aggressive campaign against the traffickers started blowing people up in public. If they couldn't bring the government to its knees by going after the government officials, they decided to go after the public and get the public to go after the government. Fortunately, the Colombian government persevered, and the level of violence has gone down dramatically in Colombia. I had a chance to visit Medellin a couple of years ago and see incredible work that the progressive mayor of that city had done to really turn the place around. And what I had known only as a city as the venue of some of the worst narcotics trafficking and violence had really blossomed into a marvelous city. But I know what a toll it took on the Colombian people.
You can see it across the border right from California, in Tijuana.
Yeah.
When President Calderon initiated his administration on December 1st, 2006, Ciudad Juárez across the border from El Paso, Texas, and Tijuana across the border from San Diego, California, were sort of the two ground zeros. They were the two emblematic cities of everything that had gone wrong in allowing these drug syndicates to expand and to corrode the the social fabric of those cities. Today, fast forward 5.5 years, and Tijuana has become one of the role models of how the strategy is succeeding. And one of the secrets was how state and local municipal authorities became co-stakeholders to the strategy, to the federal government strategy. The business sector, NGOs, they all became co-stakeholders and bought into the strategy. And one of the reasons why you've seen violent crime plummet in Tijuana, security enhanced, the take back of neighborhoods and street corners by local police is because there was a sense of co-stakeholdership that was developed in tandem with the Mexican government. One of the challenges that we have had in Ciudad Juárez, for example, is that so far has been absent. And so how do you work with municipal and state authorities, like what you saw in Colombia, is a key component of getting this strategy right.
Ambassador, one of the issues that I've spent a lot of time focusing on is that of the press and press freedom. In particular, looked at places where journalists are endangered, often by their own governments, as we see in Syria, but also often by organized crime. And I know there have been a number of recent killings of journalists in Mexico, and it's been a recurring nightmare and challenge. Part of the challenge, I know, is being able to prosecute those responsible. Otherwise, there's a sense of immunity about it. How is that proceeding? How do you evaluate the rule of law and the ability to get impartial justice?
Just yesterday, in fact, I was at the museum for the annual rededication of the memorial of journalists who've been killed in the line of duty, and we had, sadly, 4 Mexican journalists that were added yesterday to the memorial. Let's be very clear about it. A society which cannot defend its journalists from doing their work is a society that has a huge challenge. We need to provide security for journalists, but we also need to provide and develop the institutions that can investigate, prosecute, indict, sentence individuals who are killing journalists because they're doing their job and they're blowing the whistle either on corrupt mafia bosses or on corrupt officials who are in cahoots with organized crime. I think that even though the challenge is there, Mexico in the last 1.5 years has advanced in providing teeth to the legislation. There was a bill that was approved in Congress in providing prosecutorial abilities to a special division of the Federal Attorney General's office that will go after crimes against journalists. And we've been working hand in hand, for example, with the Committee for the Protection of Journalists up in New York City to be able to develop those institutions and the legislation that will allow federal authorities to go after and investigate and prosecute crimes against journalists.
I was really struck in reading some of the accounts of what journalists are experiencing in Mexico, that they would be contacted by one cartel and told, publish this particular story. They'd be contacted by the other cartel and told, don't publish this. And it was striking both in the sophistication of the cartels basically having a media strategy, but also in the kind of horrific situation that the journalist finds themselves in, where they're being threatened by 2 different cartels. It gave me just once again a renewed appreciation for the guts that journalists have around the world, but especially these days covering organized crime.
But it also brings to the fore another issue which many of us sort of take for granted. You and I and others have discussed an issue which I think is one of the main dividing debates of the 21st century world, which is between open and closed societies. And one of the characteristics of open societies is how social media and how social media platforms provide civil society with the ability to get the news out and to blow the whistle on this or that. Well, paradoxically, organized crime is as savvy or as able to use these same instruments to intimidate, to put pressure on journalists, to put pressure on rivals, to use social media platforms to intimidate rivals. So there's a very important debate that is taking place today as to how, at the same time that you ensure that social media provides civil society, journalists, citizens with the tools to know the information in real time, to get the information out, how at the same time do we prevent organized crime from using this to intimidate, to corrupt, to push back on society and on the government? And it's a very complex discussion.
Absolutely. Well, Ambassador, I know you're very familiar with this, but I wanted to share with my constituents one of the things that I think we can do to help stem the flow of narcotics and guns and cash between our borders, and that is deal with the problem of straw purchasers, who are people that buy weapons for people that are not legally allowed to have them. In other words, if I were a straw purchaser, I would go to a gun store along the border, I'd buy a bunch of weapons, and then I would transfer them unbeknownst to the law enforcement authorities to cartels. Since I am not buying them for myself, but really as a pass-through to the cartels, I am considered a straw purchaser. It's prohibited by law, but the penalties are so weak that you cannot successfully deter straw purchasers. And more than that, you can't get them to cooperate on people higher up in the trafficking organizations. So I've introduced legislation to provide mandatory penalties for straw purchasers, to beef up those penalties so that we can cut down on this traffic, because so many of the weapons that are used in this horrific violence south of our border are from America, bought and sold in America. And we need to contribute to this fight in several ways by stemming the flow of weapons and by reducing our demand at home. And I'm hopeful that we can move this bill. And
you and I have talked about this. I think this bill that you introduced to enhance, deepen sentencing of straw purchasing is so important. Let me be very clear, because there's sort of an urban myth out there that somehow the Mexican government is attempting to lobby against the Second Amendment. This has nothing to do with Second Amendment rights. I may or may not agree with the fact that you can buy a fully automatic weapon to hunt deer, but we're not seeking to undermine the Second Amendment. But what is very clear is the Second Amendment was not drafted by the Founding Fathers to allow A, weapons to illicitly cross an international border, weapons to be bought illicitly in the United States, and individuals who shouldn't be buying guns in the first place from getting their hands on weapons. So what we have asked the U.S. federal government for support is help us enforce what's already in the books, and help us close some of these loopholes, especially in regards to straw purchasing, which allows the drug trafficking syndicates to go to gun shops, to go to gun shows. They don't go themselves, of course, they're not as dumb as that, but they do use proxy purchasers, straw purchasers, to buy people who have no criminal records, who buy the weapons and then resell them or pass them on to organized crime. This is a very pressing issue. No, the issue of violence in Mexico will not be solved overnight if you were to magically stop the guns crossing the border into Mexico, but it would provide the Mexican federal authorities with the ability to rationally and efficiently and strategically use its resources to confront organized crime. Because today, every time state and local law enforcement are confronted by organized crime, we have to send in our 7th Cavalry, which is the armed forces, because they're being outgunned by .50 Barrett sniper rifles and fully automatic weapons. So this would give us the ability to use our resources in a much more strategic way, and therefore initiatives like yours are extremely important and extremely welcome.
Well, and Ambassador, you're exactly right. None of what I'm proposing, or in fact many of the other efforts that we're undertaking, have any Second Amendment problems attached to them. And I'll mention one other, and that is when someone buys multiple guns, there is a reporting requirement if you buy multiple handguns. There is no similar reporting requirement if you buy multiple long guns. This is a strange phenomenon that is just a creature of how the gun laws in this country evolved. So if you're in one of the border states and you make multiple purchases and you're straw purchasing them and you're basically conveying them into the hands of the cartels, if they're handguns, you can be ferreted out because you have to report them. If they're long guns, you can't. And long guns have long since eclipsed the use of handguns in terms of the cartel problem. Many of us are trying to ensure that we require the reporting of multiple long gun sales as well.
And the administration, this administration has done a terrific job in seeking to ensure that all border gun shops of the 4 border states with Mexico do report the multiple sales of semi-automatic and automatic long guns, which is a critical component of this equation.
Let me change topics quickly with you and turn to the economy. We are still struggling to emerge from the worst recession we've had since the Depression. We're making some progress. We've had a lot of months of sustained job growth, but it has been very slow, and we're not growing jobs fast enough to replace the ones we've lost. How has Mexico been hit by the recession? Do you see any light at the end of the tunnel in terms of your own economy? And you know, I'm sure one contributing impact on your economy is tourism. What would you advise American tourists about traveling to Mexico at this time?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we've been very lucky, but more than lucky. I think that 15 years of sustained macroeconomic policies in Mexico allowed us, after the 2009 recession, which hit all of us, to be growing at an average of 5%. We grew 5% last year. It's going to be probably a bit less this year, but we've got 4.5 growth, 3.1 inflation, 4.2 unemployment. So our figures are fantastic, especially compared to what is going on elsewhere around the world. And in part, a lot of that is due to the integrated supply and production chains that we've developed in North America, where NAFTA really and truly is a success story. It is creating jobs in North America, and it is deepening our ability to compete with the likes of China and India and other global players. On the issue of tourism, we so far are seeing very good numbers. Occupancy rates in Mexico have been, we're back at occupancy levels pre-2009. Remember 2009, we got hit by the H1N1 virus, which really sort of created a big dip in tourism. But our occupancy rates right now are very good. I think what tourists in the United States need to understand is that the violence is focalized. It is not indiscriminate. It is focalized in very specific corridors and places in Mexico. Most of them are not in the tourist resort areas. And just look at the numbers of the record number of American tourists that are going down to Mexico today. And I think that word of mouth of tourists coming back from Mexico is the most compelling case. Forget about what I have to say or what I'll say here on the screen. Talk to tourists from the United States that are going down there telling you, if you go to the right places, there is absolutely no problem.
Bess, let me ask you, it's historically been the case that Social Security in the United States was the third rail of American politics. Anyone touched it got electrocuted. That is not as true in the sense that immigration has replaced Social Security as the third rail of American politics. How do people view the immigration debate in Mexico? We're well aware of what the debate looks like here in the United States, but how do Mexicans view our debate?
Well, first let me state that there is no more important issue for the future prosperity, economic well-being, and security of the United States and Mexico than getting immigration right. And as most things in this relationship, it takes two to tango. You're going to have to do some stuff. We're going to have to do some heavy lifting. But the secret is how we anchor those women and men, those jobs in Mexico, because to put it quite frankly, our loss is your gain. If we can't hold on to these talented, entrepreneurial, bold workers, Mexico is going to suffer. We've started to see some very important changes in migration, net zero migration from Mexico into the United States this year, which tells you that the expanding Mexican economy, the dipping in the U.S. economy have had an impact on some of these flows. But at the end of the day, for many Mexicans, migration is seen through the lens of economic prosperity and fairness. Are these individuals who are contributing to the economic prosperity and well-being of America getting a fair deal? So, as most things in life, there are two different public narratives on both sides of our border, but I think there's a unique opportunity for the first time in more than a decade, given what is happening on the border today, greater operational control, a very significant dip in undocumented immigration, for our two countries to sit down in the medium term and figure out ways in which we solve this very important issue for the well-being of both nations.
Ambassador, we just have a minute or so left. Mexico and the United States both have important elections coming up, yours in July, ours in November. How do you see the future? Not necessarily who's going to win, but what does the long-term relationship between the U.S. and Mexico look like?
Well, I have to tread carefully. As you can imagine, both here and back home, I have to be seen and perceived as an equal opportunity cheerleader. So I will do precisely that and go around the question in terms of how I see that playing out. But what I can tell you is I think that citizens on both sides of the border need to understand that these two countries are uniquely important to one another. That our citizens need to understand that they need to remain co-stakeholders to each other's well-being, security, and prosperity. And that despite the Irans and the Iraqs and the Afghanistans of the world, there are probably no two countries more important for each other's future well-being, prosperity, and security than Mexico and the United States.
Well, Ambassador, you do a marvelous job, and it's a privilege to have you on our program and to call you a friend.
And thank you for all your support.
Well, thank you for all your good work. This is Congressman Adam Schiff. Thank you for joining us for another edition of Capitol Report. We hope you'll join us again next month when we will bring you a new guest. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.
Thank you for watching Capitol Report with Congressman Adam Schiff. If you have any comments, please call our office or visit Congressman Schiff's website, where you can sign up online for email updates from our nation's capital.